The rain poured relentlessly, drumming against the rooftops and turning the village roads into muddy trails. 6-year-old Lily sat by the window of her grandmother's small cottage, tracing raindrops on the glass with her tiny fingers. The world outside was blurred and gray, much like the silence that had filled her life since the accident. She had not spoken a word in nearly a year. Her grandmother, Mrs. Thompson, watched her with quiet sadness, drying dishes at the sink. It broke her heart to see the once lively and talkative child now trapped in a world of silence. No matter how many doctors she had taken Lily to, the answer was always the same. There was nothing physically wrong with her. The trauma had simply stolen her voice. Lily was not completely emotionless. She would nod when spoken to, shake her head when she disagreed, and occasionally she would smile faintly at the horses in the neighboring field. But she never played with other children, never laughed, and most painfully, never spoke. Then, something changed. That evening, as the storm raged on, Lily spotted a dark shape moving in the distance, a shadow, barely visible through the sheets of rain. She pressed her small hands against the glass, squinting. It was an animal, a dog. The creature stumbled across the muddy road, its fur matted with dirt and rain, its body frail. It hesitated near the forest's edge, then collapsed into the wet grass. Lily's heart clenched. Without a second thought, she slipped off the windowsill, grabbed her raincoat, and hurried outside before her grandmother could stop her. The storm swallowed her tiny frame as she dashed toward the collapsed figure. Her boots sank into the mud, but she didn't slow down. When she reached the dog, she saw just how weak it was. Its ribs stuck out beneath its soaked fur, its eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. For a moment, Lily hesitated. Would it bite her? Would it be afraid? But when she reached out a trembling hand, the dog did not move away. It simply looked at her, deep, warm brown eyes locking onto hers. There was no fear in them, only a quiet, heartbreaking acceptance. Lily knelt beside it, and, for the first time in so long, she made a sound, a barely audible whisper. "You're all alone, too." The dog did not respond, of course, but somehow she felt it understood. Gently, she slipped off her raincoat and draped it over the shivering creature. Then, mustering all the strength her small body had, she wrapped her arms around the dog and began to pull it up. Lily's small hands trembled as she struggled to support the dog's weight. Though thin and weak, the animal was still much heavier than she had expected. She dug her heels into the wet ground, pulling with all her strength, her fingers gripping the damp fur beneath her raincoat. The dog whimpered softly, but did not resist. It was as if it had already given up, too tired to fight for its own survival. The rain continued to pour, soaking through Lily's clothes, but she didn't care. All that mattered was getting the dog somewhere safe. "Lily!" Her grandmother's voice cut through the storm. A moment later, a flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the scene before her. Mrs. Thompson rushed forward, her boots splashing through puddles. "What are you doing out here?" she cried, pulling Lily away from the animal and kneeling beside it. The old woman's hands were experienced and gentle, quickly assessing the dog's condition. "Oh, you poor thing." Lily tugged at her grandmother's sleeve and pointed toward the house, her eyes pleading. Mrs. Thompson hesitated. Taking in a stray was risky. He could be sick. He could belong to someone. But then she looked at Lily, really looked at her. The little girl's expression held something she hadn't seen in so long. Desperation, determination, a spark of life. With a sigh, Mrs. Thompson nodded. "All right, but just for tonight." Lily's face lit up with something close to relief. Together, they lifted the dog as carefully as they could, and half carried, half dragged it toward the cottage. Inside, the warmth of the house wrapped around them like a blanket. Mrs. Thompson spread an old towel near the fireplace, and Lily knelt beside the dog, gently drying its fur. Up close, she could see it was even worse off than she had thought. Its ribs jutted out, its paws were scraped and bloody, and one of its ears had a jagged tear, as if it had been in a fight. Mrs. Thompson returned with a bowl of warm broth. The dog sniffed it weakly, then began lapping it up with slow, deliberate movements. Lily watched, holding her breath, afraid it would stop eating at any moment. But it finished the entire bowl, then rested its head on the towel, letting out a long, tired sigh. "That's a good sign," Mrs. Thompson murmured. Lily hesitated, then reached out and gently touched the dog's head. Its fur was coarse and uneven, but beneath the roughness, she felt warmth. Real warmth. Not like the cold, empty feeling she had carried inside her for so long. The dog didn't pull away. A name. It needed a name. Lily pressed her lips together, thinking. She hadn't spoken in a year, but now the urge to give this creature a name burned inside her. She took a deep breath, parted her lips, and nothing came out. The frustration was instant and overwhelming. Her throat tightened. She clenched her fists. Why? Why couldn't she just say it? Mrs. Thompson noticed her struggle and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's all right, sweetheart," she said softly. "You can tell me in your own way." Lily bit her lip, then, after a moment, took a piece of paper from the table and wrote one word in shaky, uneven letters. "Bruno." Mrs. Thompson smiled. "Bruno," she repeated, looking at the dog. "That's a strong name." Bruno's ears twitched slightly at the sound. His eyes opened just a little, and for the first time, Lily swore she saw something there. Recognition. Almost as if the name meant something to him, too. She didn't know why, but the thought sent a strange chill down her spine. Over the next few days, Bruno slowly regained his strength. Mrs. Thompson, despite her initial hesitation, helped care for him, cleaning his wounds, feeding him small portions of food, and even letting him sleep by the fireplace. Lily, of course, never left his side. She would sit beside him for hours, running her fingers through his fur, drawing pictures of him in her notebook, and whispering words that only he could hear. She couldn't explain it, but with Bruno, it felt easier, like the silence between them wasn't empty, but full of understanding. Bruno, for his part, never barked, never whined. He simply watched her with those deep, knowing eyes, as if he could hear all the things she couldn't say. Then, the dreams started. The first one was hazy. Lily saw flashes of a younger Bruno, strong, energetic, running through a sunlit field. A laugh rang through the air. A woman's laugh. It was familiar, but Lily couldn't place it. The second dream was different. Darker. She saw Bruno again, but this time he was scared. Running. There were voices yelling, tires screeching, and then nothing. She woke up gasping, her heart pounding. Lily didn't know what the dreams meant, but one thing was clear. Bruno wasn't just any dog. There was something about him, something buried deep in her past that she couldn't quite grasp. And she was determined to find out the truth. Lily couldn't shake the feeling that Bruno was more than just a stray. Every time she looked into his deep brown eyes, she felt a strange sense of familiarity, like a memory just out of reach. She spent every moment with him. In the mornings, they would sit together on the porch, watching the mist roll over the hills. In the afternoons, she would take him to the edge of the forest, where he would sniff the air cautiously, his ears twitching as if listening for something unseen. And then there were the nights. Lily's dreams became more vivid. She saw glimpses of places she didn't recognize. An old house with white shutters, a swing hanging from a tree, a garden full of sunflowers. But the strangest part was the voices. In one dream she heard a woman's voice, soft and warm. "Bruno, come here, boy." Laughter. A child's giggle. Then, suddenly, a loud crash. Screaming. Tires screeching. And Bruno, running towards something. Or away. Lily woke up with a gasp, her heart pounding. She sat up in bed, breathing hard. Bruno was lying beside her, his head resting on his paws, but as soon as she moved, his ears perked up. She reached out and touched his fur. "Who are you?" she whispered, even though she knew he couldn't answer. Bruno licked her hand gently, as if to say, "I'm here. That's all that matters." But for Lily, it wasn't enough. She needed to know the truth. The next morning, Lily decided to search for answers. If Bruno really did have a past connected to her, there had to be some clue, some proof. While her grandmother was in the kitchen making tea, Lily sneaked into the attic. The air smelled of dust and old wood, and the dim light filtered through the small round window. Boxes were stacked high, labeled with faded handwriting. She started opening them carefully. Old clothes, Christmas decorations, a box full of baby toys, and then photographs. Her hands trembled as she lifted a dusty album from the bottom of the pile. She carried it to the light and slowly flipped through the pages. Pictures of her parents. Her chest tightened. It had been so long since she had seen their faces, her father's bright blue eyes, her mother's kind smile. She traced their faces with her fingertips, and then her breath caught in her throat. A picture of a dog, a younger, stronger, healthier version of Bruno, standing proudly beside her father, his tail wagging, his eyes full of life. Lily's heart pounded. She turned the page and found another picture. This time, Bruno was sitting in the backyard of a house she didn't recognize. A little girl stood beside him, laughing. Her. She was smaller, maybe 3 or 4 years old. She was hugging Bruno, her face lit up with pure joy. Lily felt dizzy. Her mind raced. Bruno wasn't just any stray. He had been her dog. Tears blurred her vision as Lily ran down the attic steps, the album clutched in her hands. She burst into the kitchen, where her grandmother nearly dropped her teacup in surprise. "Lily!" Mrs. Thompson gasped. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" Lily didn't answer. She just shoved the album onto the table and pointed at the picture with wide, desperate eyes. Mrs. Thompson put on her glasses and leaned in. The moment she saw the image, her face went pale. "Oh, my God," she whispered. She sat down heavily, pressing a hand to her mouth. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then her gaze softened, and she looked at Lily with something between sorrow and wonder. "Lily, you don't remember, do you?" Lily shook her head. Mrs. Thompson let out a shaky breath. "Bruno was your family's dog," she said gently. "Your father got him as a puppy when you were born. He was your best friend." Lily's chest ached. She looked at Bruno, who sat quietly by her feet, watching them both. "He was in the car with you," her grandmother continued, "the day of the accident." Lily froze. "You and Bruno were in the back seat," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice thick with emotion. "When the crash happened, the car flipped. Your parents didn't make it, but you were thrown from the car before the fire started." Lily's hands clenched the edge of the table. "You were unconscious when they found you," Mrs. Thompson said softly. "And Bruno, he was gone. We thought he died that day." Lily looked down at Bruno, her vision blurred by tears. But he hadn't died. He had survived. And after all these years, he had found his way back to her. She dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around him, sobbing into his fur. Bruno didn't move. He simply let her hold him. His body warm, steady, real. For the first time in a year, Lily spoke. Through the tears, through the ache in her throat, she whispered one word. "Bruno." Mrs. Thompson gasped, covering her mouth in shock. But Lily didn't notice. She just held on to Bruno, finally understanding what she had felt all along. He had come back to her. No matter how far he had traveled, no matter how many years had passed, Bruno had never truly left. Because some bonds, the strongest bonds, can never be broken. Lily sat on the floor, still clutching Bruno, as if he might disappear if she let go. The revelation crashed over her like a wave. Her best friend, the dog she had lost, had never stopped searching for her. And somehow, against all odds, he had found his way back. Mrs. Thompson knelt beside her, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I don't know how he survived," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But he did. And after all these years, he found you." Lily pulled back slightly and looked into Bruno's deep brown eyes. They were the same as in the photograph, the same eyes she had loved as a child, the same eyes that had watched over her. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers brushing the scar on his ear. Where had he been all this time? Her grandmother seemed to read her thoughts. "He must have been out there alone for years," she said softly. "Wandering, surviving." A pause. "Waiting for you." Lily's chest ached. Had Bruno spent all this time searching for her? Had he been cold, hungry, afraid? The thought made her stomach twist. A sudden urgency filled her. She needed to know everything. She jumped up and ran back to the attic, her bare feet barely making a sound on the wooden stairs. Mrs. Thompson called after her, but Lily wasn't listening. She rummaged through the box of photographs again, flipping through them quickly, looking for more clues. And then she found it. A newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, tucked between the pages of the album. "Tragic accident leaves. Young child orphaned. Search for family." "Dog continues," Lily's breath caught. She skimmed the article, her hands trembling. It was from the day after the accident. The report confirmed that both her parents had died at the scene, but the part that made her blood run cold was at the bottom. The family dog, a German Shepherd mix named Bruno, was last seen at the crash site before disappearing into the nearby woods. Rescue teams searched for him, but after several days, authorities presumed he had either succumbed to his injuries or was too frightened to return. If anyone sees a dog matching his description, they are urged to contact local shelters immediately. Lily's grip on the paper tightened. He had been there. He had seen everything. And then he had run. Why? Her mind spun with questions. Had he been too scared? Too injured? Had he waited for her, only to realize she wasn't coming back? Her hands trembled as she set the newspaper down. She needed answers. She needed to know where Bruno had been all these years. That night, Lily could barely sleep. The questions swirled in her mind like a storm. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw flashes of the accident, things she hadn't remembered before. The blinding headlights, the sound of tires screeching, the deafening crash. And Bruno. Always Bruno. She woke up before dawn, her heart racing. The house was silent, the soft tick of the clock the only sound. Bruno lay curled at the foot of her bed, sleeping peacefully. But as if sensing her movement, his eyes flickered open. He lifted his head, watching her. Lily sat up. "Show me," she whispered. Bruno's ears twitched. She slid out of bed and crept toward the door. Bruno followed silently, his paws making no sound on the wooden floor. Together they stepped outside into the cool night air. The village was still asleep, the streets empty. The sky was a deep shade of indigo, the first hints of morning light creeping over the horizon. Lily didn't hesitate. She turned toward the forest. Bruno hesitated for only a second before following. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. The deeper they went, the thicker the mist became. Lily's breath puffed out in the cold air, but she wasn't afraid. Because Bruno was with her. She didn't know how she knew where to go. She just did. It was as if her feet were carrying her down a path she had walked before long ago. The deeper they went, the stronger the pull became. Then Bruno stopped. Lily turned. He stood frozen, his ears perked, his body tense, his eyes locked onto something ahead. Lily followed his gaze, and then she saw it. A rusted road sign, barely visible through the overgrown brush. The paint was chipped and faded, but the words were still clear enough to read. Route 27. Danger. Sharp turn ahead. Lily's blood ran cold. This was it. This was where it had happened. Lily took a slow, shaky step forward. The road was still there, barely visible beneath the layers of dirt and fallen leaves. Time had tried to erase it, but she could still see the faint outline of tire marks, long since faded. Bruno stood beside her, his body rigid. His ears twitched, his nose sniffing the air. And then he moved. Without hesitation, he stepped off the road and into the woods. Lily followed. They walked for what felt like forever, deeper and deeper into the trees. The air was thick with silence. Then Bruno stopped again. He pawed at the ground. Lily's breath caught. She dropped to her knees and began brushing away the dirt and leaves with her hands. The ground was uneven, disturbed. And then her fingers scraped against something hard. Metal. She dug faster. Bruno whined softly beside her, his body pressing close. And then she uncovered it. A collar. Her breath hitched as she pulled it free. The leather was cracked with age, the metal tag rusted, but she could still make out the engraving. Bruno. Lily's hands shook. She turned the collar over, her heart hammering, and on the inside, scratched into the leather, were 4 simple words. I will find you. Tears burned in her eyes. She looked at Bruno, and in that moment, she understood. After the accident, he had run. Not because he was afraid, but because he had been looking for her. For all these years, he had searched. Through towns and fields, through storms and cold nights, he had never stopped. And now, he had finally kept his promise. Lily threw her arms around him, burying her face in his fur. You found me, she whispered, her voice cracking. Bruno let out a soft whimper and pressed his head against her. He had never truly been lost, because home wasn't a place. Home was wherever they were together. Lily sat in the middle of the forest, gripping Bruno's old collar as the weight of everything settled over her. The cold morning air bit at her skin, but she barely noticed. Her mind was spinning, her heart aching. Bruno had searched for her all these years. He had never given up. And now, she needed to understand the full story. Taking a deep breath, she turned to her faithful companion. Bruno, she murmured, running her fingers through his fur. Show me where you went. Bruno lifted his head, his ears perking at the sound of her voice. For a moment, he just looked at her, his deep brown eyes searching hers as if making sure she was ready. Then, slowly, he stood and took a step forward. Lily followed. The forest was thick with the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying echoes of the past. Lily's heart pounded with every step, her breath coming in small, visible puffs in the cool air. Bruno moved with purpose, his paws finding an invisible trail through the undergrowth. They walked for what felt like miles, deeper and deeper into the forest. Then, suddenly, Bruno stopped. Lily frowned, looking around. There was nothing here, just trees, rocks, and tangled roots. But Bruno's body was tense, his tail lowered, his ears flicking back. Lily stepped closer. "What is it, boy?" Bruno let out a low whimper, then nudged the ground with his nose. Lily's stomach twisted. She knelt beside him and carefully brushed away the leaves and dirt. And then she saw it. A small, weathered wooden cross, half buried in the earth. Lily's breath hitched. She reached out with trembling fingers, tracing the rough wood. Someone had placed it here. Someone had marked this spot. Her eyes darted back to Bruno. "Did you?" Bruno whined softly and lay down beside the cross, resting his head against the ground. Lily's heart shattered. This was where he had waited. For years, maybe longer, Bruno had returned to this place, holding on to the past, hoping for something. Someone. Tears welled in her eyes. She reached for Bruno and pulled him close. "I'm so sorry," she whispered into his fur. "I didn't know. I didn't remember." Bruno let out a deep sigh and pressed against her, as if telling her it was okay, that it had never been about blame, only love. But Lily wasn't done yet. She wiped her tears and looked around. Someone had put this cross here, which meant someone had known Bruno. Someone had cared. And she needed to find out who. Lily and Bruno made their way back through the forest, her mind racing. If Bruno had survived the accident, if he had lived out here all these years, then someone must have seen him. There was one place she hadn't been in years. The old stone cottage at the edge of the woods. It was a place she had only visited once or twice when she was younger. An old man lived there, Mr. Harris. He had always been a quiet, solitary figure in the village, rarely seen except for occasional visits to the market. If anyone knew something, it would be him. Lily hesitated for only a moment before knocking on the heavy wooden door. Silence. Then, shuffling footsteps. The door creaked open, revealing a man with a lined face and piercing gray eyes. His gaze flickered over Lily before settling on Bruno. Something shifted in his expression. "I was wondering when you'd come," he murmured. Lily's breath caught. "You know him." Mr. Harris sighed and opened the door wider. "Come inside." The cottage smelled of burning wood and old books. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. Mr. Harris gestured for Lily to sit, while Bruno lay down near the fire. The old man took his time, pouring them both cups of tea before finally speaking. "I found him not long after the accident," he said, his voice low. "He was hurt, badly. I don't know how he survived, but when I saw him limping through the forest, I knew he wasn't just another stray." Lily's hands tightened around the warm mug. "He wouldn't let me near him at first," Mr. Harris continued. "He was wild, afraid. But he never left this forest, always circling the same places, always searching." He looked at Bruno with something like admiration. "I fed him when I could, left out blankets in the winter. But he never stayed for long. He always went back to that spot." Lily swallowed the lump in her throat. The grave? Mr. Harris nodded. He dug that himself. Lily gasped. What? The old man sighed. I don't know what he was thinking. Maybe he thought you were buried there. Maybe he was marking the last place he saw your family. But he returned to it, over and over, waiting, even when the seasons changed, even when the years passed. Lily covered her mouth, her vision blurring. Bruno had spent years mourning her, believing she was lost. And yet, he had never given up. She reached for him, running her fingers through his fur. He leaned into her touch, letting out a deep sigh. I always knew he was waiting for something, Mr. Harris murmured. I just didn't know it was you. Lily looked up, her heart pounding. Why didn't you tell anyone? The old man hesitated. I tried, he admitted. When I saw the newspaper about the accident, I searched for your family. But when I heard you had been sent away to live with relatives, I thought... He trailed off. I thought it was better to let him be. He didn't trust anyone but the memories he held on to. Lily's throat tightened. Bruno had never stopped waiting, never stopped hoping. And now, finally, his wait was over. The walk back to the village was quiet. Lily's heart felt heavier than ever, yet somehow lighter too. She understood now. Bruno had been lost, just like her. But in the end, they had found their way back to each other. Mrs. Thompson was waiting at the door when they returned. The moment she saw Lily's tear-streaked face, she knew something had changed. Lily knelt beside Bruno and gently placed the old collar around his neck. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with something deep and unspoken. We're home now, she whispered. Bruno pressed his nose against her hand, his tail wagging softly. After all these years, after all the waiting, they were finally where they belonged, together. The days that followed were unlike anything Lily had ever known. She and Bruno settled into a quiet rhythm, as if no time had passed at all, as if he had always been by her side. The villagers whispered about it, of course. How could he have survived for so long? It's like something out of a storybook. But Lily didn't care about the whispers. All that mattered was the warm weight of Bruno's head resting on her lap when she sat by the fire, the way he nudged her hand when she got lost in thought, the quiet sighs he let out as he dozed beside her bed each night. He was home, and so was she. But something still lingered in Lily's heart, an ache, a question left unanswered. She needed to say goodbye properly. One crisp autumn morning, Lily packed a small satchel and whistled for Bruno. He came immediately, his tail wagging as he trotted to her side. Mrs. Thompson watched from the doorway. Going somewhere? Lily nodded. Back to the forest. The older woman hesitated, then simply said, Take your time. Lily smiled softly and set off. Bruno led the way, his paws finding the path as if he had walked it 1,000 times, which, of course, he had. When they reached the grave, Lily knelt beside it. She took a deep breath and ran her fingers over the rough wood of the cross. For years, she had avoided this moment, too afraid to look back. But now, she realized, she wasn't alone anymore. Bruno lay beside her, pressing against her side. His warmth steadied her, anchored her. Lily reached into her bag and pulled out something small, a photograph. It was an old one, slightly faded, but still clear enough to see. A little girl, no older than 6, with bright eyes and a toothy grin. A man and a woman, their arms wrapped around her. And at the bottom of the frame, a young, eager Bruno, his tongue hanging out in a happy pant. Lily traced the image with her fingertip before placing it gently at the base of the cross. "I didn't forget you," she whispered. "I never could." Bruno let out a quiet whimper, as if he understood. Lily closed her eyes and let the wind carry away her sadness, bit by bit. When she finally stood, she felt lighter. Not because the pain was gone, but because she knew she didn't have to carry it alone anymore. Winter came, but for the first time in years, Lily wasn't afraid of the cold. She and Bruno spent their days exploring, walking through the village, curled up by the fire in the evenings. The nightmares that had once haunted her began to fade, replaced by new memories, better memories. And Bruno, he thrived. His fur grew shinier, his steps lighter. He no longer looked over his shoulder, no longer searched the horizon for something just out of reach. Because what he had been searching for had finally found him. One evening, as Lily sat on the porch, watching the snowflakes drift down, she felt a familiar weight press against her legs. Bruno looked up at her, his eyes warm and knowing. "We made it, didn't we?" she murmured, scratching behind his ears. Bruno let out a soft, contented huff and rested his head in her lap. They had spent years lost, searching for something they thought they'd never find again. But in the end, love had led them home. Together. Forever.